at just the time of this incredible expansion of Rome, the beginnings of the Roman Empire, as Rome was becoming the Mediterranean superpower, there were growing internal problems within Rome itself. And this period is often called the crisis of the Roman Republic, period dated from around 134 BCE down to 44 BCE, the date of the assassination of Julius Caesar. So this is a long crisis, a crisis that lasts almost for a century. And it arose out of a few related problems. The first was a problem of growing wealth inequality, something that has come up before in this class and that has been talked a lot about in recent years in the United States and around the world. In essence, in the 2nd century BCE, the elite, the senatorial aristocracy, the ones who ran the show in the Roman Republic, these people were coming to control more and more of the land. And land was the most valuable commodity in this society. And these senatorial elites are coming to build bigger and bigger estates called latifundia, basically big plantations that are worked by larger and larger gangs of slave laborers. Now, back in the time of the early Roman Republic, there had been many citizens who were just kind of small-time farmers, basically ran family farms, but they were becoming poorer and poorer as time went on. And very often now, as we get into the 2nd century BCE, these small-time citizen farmers were very often forced to sell their lands to the elites, to the members of the senatorial aristocracy, and then these former farmers would often move to the cities, either to the city of Rome or other provincial cities, where they came to make up a large class of landless day laborers. And this is not a recipe for stability in any society, to have large numbers of kind of rootless, disenfranchised, disgruntled citizens in the cities of the civilization. Now, we talked before about the constant tension between the elite, the patricians or the senatorial aristocracy, and the people, the plebs. And there were some efforts to try to remedy this impoverishment of the Roman citizenry, of the common Roman citizens. And most importantly, there were two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, who served as tribunes of the plebs in the mid-2nd century. And in that capacity, as tribunes of the plebs, they proposed a series of land reform bills that advocated for a redistribution of land to the poor, to the citizen poor. And part of the problem had been that the senatorial elite were using their privileges, their connections, not only to buy up land from poor farmers, but they were also, in essence, squatting on public lands that were actually owned by the Roman state. But because, senators knew the right people, they were able to kind of appropriate some of that public land for themselves, use it as if it were their own property. And what the Gracchi, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, said, basically, was, wouldn't it make more sense if we gave some of that public land to the poor, rather than giving it to those who are already rich? It's a sensible message, but it's not one that the senatorial aristocracy wanted to hear. If these bills had gone through, they would have taken much of the land and much of the sources of wealth away from the senatorial elites, so they were not okay with this. And as a result, Tiberius Gracchus, the older of the Gracchi brothers, was murdered. He was actually beaten to death by agents, kind of goons of the senators, who beat Tiberius to death with chairs and benches in 133 BCE. Bravely, Tiberius's brother Gaius Gracchus took up the cause of the poor after Tiberius's death, but he in turn was forced to commit suicide rather than die at the hands of another mob sent by the senators in 121 BCE. So the Gracchi had attempted to solve this problem of disgruntled, disenfranchised, landless poor, and this impoverishment of the common citizens, but they're murdered before those problems can be resolved. A second related problem had to do with the army. Now, the Roman army had, in the early days of the Republic, always been a citizen army. You had to be a citizen to fight in the army, and there were property qualifications. You had to have a certain amount of land in order to serve in the army. And in the early Republic, there was no standing Roman army. There wasn't a permanent army. The army was raised when it was needed for emergencies. Remember, I said that the Romans always claimed they were defending themselves, even as they were building an empire. And so when an army was needed, the call would go out, the Roman citizens would get together, they'd go fight, and then when the war was done, they'd go home. And so the Romans are very good soldiers, but at first they are part-time soldiers. Now, as Rome was amassing an empire, it became more and more necessary to have armies all the time, to have standing armies. And with the impoverishment of common Roman citizens, there were fewer and fewer men who met the property qualifications to serve in the army. So you have this problem where you need more and more soldiers, but fewer and fewer people meet the requirements to serve as soldiers. So eventually, the Roman government is forced to drop the property qualification for service, and it allowed landless Romans to join the armies. But this created a little problem because it meant now that the men who were fighting in the armies were not necessarily motivated out of some kind of pure sense of patriotism, an attempt to defend the Republic. These were men who were fighting because they needed money. They needed cash to support themselves and to support their families. So their motivations are a little bit different. And so what happens is that individual Roman generals begin to recruit their own armies personally by offering nice salaries to potential recruits, and especially by promising recruits that the general would give them a nice little farm plot of their own when they retire from the army as veterans. So the general makes a deal basically with a recruit. Look, if you sign up, join my army, you'll retire, you'll live a nice, good life in the countryside with your family, on the family farm. And if you're a poor, landless Roman struggling to make ends meet, that's a pretty good bargain. But in exchange, these Roman generals begin to demand that their soldiers swear loyalty oaths to them personally. Oaths not to the Roman government, not to the Senate, but to the general himself. And you can probably see why this might be dangerous. You now have, from the 2nd century BC on, the 100s BCE on, you have armies that owe their allegiance not to the Roman state, but to these powerful individuals, to generals. The result was that more and more power resided not so much with the senatorial aristocracy, not with the consuls and other magistrates. Power more and more rested with these generals, who controlled the now permanent Roman armies that were personally loyal to them, to the generals. Now this brought about several crises in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. First, it led to a showdown between two of these powerful generals, named Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, which broke out into civil war in the 80s BCE. But most importantly, beginning in 60 BCE, the Roman state was controlled by three powerful generals: Marcus Licinius Crassus, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey, and Gaius Julius Caesar. And these three came to a kind of power-sharing agreement. They said, look, we are all powerful generals, we have big armies behind us, but let's make a deal. And these three guys make a kind of non-aggression pact with each other, and in essence ruled as the so-called First Triumvirate. And triumvirate literally means rule by three men, a triumviri, three men. And so in the first triumvirate, although the Senate and all of that stuff still exists, there are still consuls, it's really these three generals that have the real power, that can really call the shots. It's these strong men who each controls his own armies, who are personally loyal to him. This worked for a while, but eventually this first triumvirate falls apart when one of the trio, Crassus, dies in battle, fighting against the Parthians in the east in 53 BCE. Now, there had been this kind of delicate balance of power between the three, but now with Crassus out of the picture and dead, that just leaves these two men, Pompey and Caesar, Julius Caesar, to face off. And, one of them is going to have to win out. One is going to lose, one is going to win. They can't share power between the two of them. And so eventually the Senate has to step in and decide, okay, which horse are we backing here? Pompey or Julius Caesar? And the Senate chooses Pompey. And in fact, they choose Pompey because he's the weaker of the two. He seems a little bit less threatening to the Senate. They think maybe we can control this guy. This was not a wise decision, as it turns out. Julius Caesar refuses to accept the decision, and although the Senate tells Caesar to, set aside his weapons, to abandon his army, disband his army, instead Caesar refuses to abide by this decision, and instead leads his army out of Gaul, what today would be France, which is where he was campaigning, and instead turns his army around and leads it into Italy itself. And this is, if you've ever heard of the expression of crossing the Rubicon, in 49 BCE, Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon River into northeast Italy. And the reason this is such a big deal is that it represents Caesar leading his army out of the province in which he was authorized to lead it, Gaul or France, and instead leading that army into Italy, into the heart of the Roman Empire. This is an illegal action. This is an act of war. This is a general turning his men against Rome itself. And so this action, the crossing of the Rubicon by Caesar in 49 BCE, marks the start of another Roman civil war, often just called the Great Roman Civil War or Caesar's Civil War. Julius Caesar defeats Pompey in 48 BCE at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey actually survives that battle, but he is murdered soon after when he tries to flee to Egypt, which is still independent of Rome at this point. And so Julius Caesar is now alone the dominant power in Rome. He is the last man standing. And in 47 BCE, Julius Caesar has the Senate, which really has no choice in the matter. He has the Senate declare him dictator. Now, dictator is a position that had existed from the time of the early Roman Republic, and it was intended to be used in cases of real emergency, a state of emergency. Sometimes you need one guy to temporarily take charge of the entire government. So, for instance, when Rome is being threatened by invasion, the city of Rome itself is in danger, maybe two consuls can't cooperate, you need one guy with full authority to take charge. The most famous example of this in the early Republic occurred supposedly in 457 BCE, when a Roman named Cincinnatus is called upon when Rome is under threat. And the story goes that Cincinnatus had been in the fields plowing, living a peaceful life, when some representatives of the Senate come to him and say, "No, Cincinnatus, your country needs you. Come defend the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic." So Cincinnatus reluctantly sets aside his plow, goes and leads the army to victory, and then returns to his fields, takes up the plow just where he had left it before. That was the ideal, that a dictator was a very temporary position. But now, in 47 BCE, Julius Caesar is granted that title in recognition of the fact that in a way, he already has all the real power anyway. As I said, the Senate really had no choice but to grant him this title of dictator. So the senators really had to do this because Caesar had all the power, but the senators were not happy about it. This perpetual dictatorship to them looked exactly like a monarchy, which they had been taught from their childhood is something hated by all Romans. You know, we Romans got rid of kings back in 509 BCE when we kicked out Tarquin. We're not going to bow down to kings. We don't worship kings. We kill kings. That's what Romans do. And so on March 15th, 44 BCE, the famous Ides of March, which is the date on the Roman calendar, Caesar is assassinated, stabbed to death by a group of Roman senators. Well, if the senators thought that that would solve all of their problems, they were very, very wrong. In fact, the assassination of Julius Caesar leads to the outbreak of yet another civil war, a civil war which ultimately pits Julius Caesar's adopted son, named Octavian, or Octavius, against another general who had been one of Julius Caesar's lieutenants, named Mark Antony, or Marcus Antonius. Marcus Antonius eventually allies himself with Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, who ruled Egypt as one of the Ptolemaic rulers. Cleopatra was a member of that Ptolemaic Hellenistic dynasty of Egypt. And Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra got married, but Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by Octavian at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. And realizing that their position was hopeless after the Battle of Actium, Antony and Cleopatra famously commit suicide in 30 BCE. And according to legend, Cleopatra does the deed by putting a venomous snake, an asp, to her breast, but not very realistic. That would be a pretty horrible way to commit suicide. This had the effect not just of leaving Octavian as the sole power in Rome, but it also added Egypt as a Roman territory, as yet another Roman province. So after the Battle of Actium, Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, is now the sole power in Rome. And in a really kind of Orwellian moment, in 27 BCE, Octavian goes before the Senate in Rome and formally declares the restoration of the Republic. He says, you're welcome. The Republic is back in business, and now I will retire. And so at the ripe old age of 36, Octavian claims, okay, I'm setting aside power, I'm going to retire. Now, this was all political theater. Octavian had no intention of actually retiring. And very conveniently, some of the senators plead with him to reconsider, to stay in power and help Rome. No, Octavian, don't retire. Your country needs you. Please remain in power. Pretty quickly, the other senators got the hint. Oh, okay, this is what we're doing. This is political theater. Oh, please, Octavian, stay in power. We need you. We want you to stick around. And so Octavian can kind of play the modest Roman who doesn't really want to seize power. But in fact, there is no realistic way that the old Republican government is going to return. The Republic is dead. This is the beginning of the line of Roman emperors. So you have the situation in which really one man has the power, but that man is denying the reality. He's saying that the Republic has been restored when nothing could be further from the truth. The Senate grants Octavian the title Augustus, which means the revered one. This is a title that previously had only been used for Roman gods, but now it's being applied to a mortal, to Octavian. And so from this moment on, from 27 BCE on, we generally refer to this guy not as Octavian, but as Caesar Augustus. But it's the same guy, Octavian, but now that he's in power, we call him Caesar Augustus. But Augustus always maintained, he always insisted that, in fact, he had restored the Republic. All signs to the contrary. The Republic has been restored. And in fact, the main title that he used for himself was princeps, which means something like first citizen. And so the idea is, this is Augustus saying, look, I'm just the first among equals. I'm just like all of the other citizens. I don't have any special powers. And because he preferred this term princeps as a title, this period of the Roman Empire is sometimes called the Principate, the early Roman Republic. But in fact, whatever Augustus may have claimed, he was really the first Roman emperor. And the word that we use, emperor, comes from the Latin word imperator, which originally just meant general, but over time it took on this sense of emperor. But again, Augustus didn't like that term. He didn't like to be presented as a dictator, as an authoritarian. He wanted to be seen as the first among equals, as the princeps. So Augustus, throughout his reign as emperor, and that's what he really was, the first emperor, he was always very careful to show respect for the old institutions of the Republic, especially the Senate. And so Augustus really went out of his way to make these senators feel special and make them feel important. But really, the real power was with Augustus now. He still controlled the army, including the Praetorian Guard, an army that was resident in Italy itself as his private army, kind of his private bodyguards. And Augustus was building up a whole administration, a whole bureaucracy that was directly subject to him, not to the Senate. And really, it is now Augustus and his administrators that are running the Roman Empire, not the senatorial elites. And so, in essence, Augustus gives the Senate back its prestige and its perks, but he didn't give them back any of the real power. He held the real power. And so, from the time of Augustus on, the Senate becomes basically a kind of country club, a place where rich guys can hang out with each other and feel important and special. The successors of Augustus were not nearly as cagey as he was, and already in the time of Tiberius Caesar, who followed Augustus as emperor, Tiberius was Augustus's stepson, there is no more any illusion that the emperor is really in charge. From the time of Tiberius on, it's clear there is an emperor, there is a new regime that's running things. Now, there were, as you have probably heard, kind of crazy, vicious emperors. You've surely heard of Nero, of Caligula. But in fact, the early emperors were quite effective and really brought unprecedented peace to the Roman Empire. As we said, since the 2nd century BCE, Rome had been racked by civil war, by conflict. But now, under the emperors, we have the beginning of a period that we refer to as the Pax Romana. That's Latin for the Roman peace, which begins around 27 BCE, when Caesar Augustus assumes power, and lasts to about 180 CE, or AD. So that's a period of about 200 years, a period of relative peace and stability within the Roman Empire, and a period in which the empire was generally well governed. And it's in this period, the Pax Romana, that the Roman Empire would reach its fullest extent, its largest size, under the Emperor Trajan in 117 CE. And this was an empire that stretched all the way from Britain, from England, in the northwest, where Hadrian's Wall marked the northernmost extreme of the empire, all the way to Mesopotamia, to the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in the southeast. This is an empire that included all of present-day France, parts of what are now Germany as far east as the Rhine, modern Austria, parts of modern Slovenia and Hungary, all of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and that sliver of fertile land all along the northern coast of Africa on the Mediterranean Sea, north of the Sahara, so through Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. The empire included all of modern Greece and Turkey, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and east into modern Iraq. This is a huge empire. There in the east, the Romans are bordered by the Persian Empire, a revived Persian Empire, first of the Parthians and then of the Sassanids. And this Parthian and Sassanid Empire is really the only neighbor of Rome that can be considered kind of anything close to their equals in terms of scale and sophistication. So in the Mediterranean world, Rome is dominant. It is the only game in town. And the Mediterranean Sea really is right at the center of the Roman Empire. And as we said, the Romans called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea. This is the center of our world. And the Mediterranean was the geographical center of the empire, the hole in the donut. But it's also at the heart of the empire in virtually every other way. It's across the Mediterranean Sea that armies are transported. Grain is moved across the Mediterranean from the empire's breadbaskets in places like Sicily and North Africa to the giant cities like Rome, these hungry cities. And also culturally, the Mediterranean Sea is central to Roman civilization. To the Roman way of thinking, anything far away from the Mediterranean was likely to be a barbarous place. The culture of the Mediterranean of the Romans is a culture of wine and olive oil. Anything else is uncivilized. So, for instance, those horrible people who live up in Germany beyond the Rhine, who drink beer and eat butter, that's horrendous as far as the Romans are concerned. And this vast Mediterranean empire, at its largest extent under Trajan, extended roughly 3,000 miles from end to end, and it encompassed about 3 million square miles, and had a population of around 50 to 70 million people. Now, an empire that big, in terms of size and in terms of population, is bound to be diverse, to encompass a large number of different people that have different local customs and their own languages. But there was a culture that united the Roman Empire, and that was Greco-Roman culture. The Romans admired the Greeks. And so, for instance, wealthy senators in Rome would very often send their sons to study in Athens, to go study philosophy at the center of the Greek world. Sculptures were being shipped by the shipload from Greece into Italy so that the elites of Rome could decorate their villas and their city houses, their townhouses, with real Greek sculpture. So the Romans really are the inheritors of the legacy of the Hellenistic period, of that diffusion of Greek culture around the Mediterranean world and into the Near East. And that culture becomes the culture of Rome and helps the Romans to unify this huge, diverse empire. But the Romans also take active measures to unite their empire together, above all physically, in terms of a unified architecture, infrastructure, and system of urban planning that could be found all across the Roman Empire. Now, we said that the Romans were great engineers as well as great soldiers, and you can see this above all in the great capital itself, at the city of Rome, which at its height had a population of around 1 million people. And you can still see the great buildings of the Roman Forum, the Colosseum, where gladiator fights and other entertainments were held. You can see it in the remnants, not much now, of the Circus Maximus, which was the stadium for chariot races, which were incredibly popular in the Roman Empire. You can see it in the massive public baths, such as those built by the Emperor Caracalla in the city of Rome. And all that and much, much more is just within the city of Rome itself, the capital. But just as important, the Romans took kind of miniature versions of all of these urban amenities to all of the big cities of their empire. And so, for instance, you can see Roman arena in the city of Arles in the south of France, almost like a miniature version of the Colosseum. You can see at the extreme northwestern edge of the empire the Roman baths at the city of Bath in England. You can see it in the aqueducts that are found all across the Roman Empire. Here is a remarkable example surviving in the city of Segovia in Spain, one of the Roman provinces. And so all of these things, not just the roads, but the theaters, the amphitheaters, the aqueducts, these were standard amenities that you could expect to find anywhere in the Roman Empire. In any sizable city, you would find these standard features. And generally, you could also find decent Roman government and Roman law and Roman order. These were things that, by and large, the people of the empire appreciated. So this period, the Pax Romana, beginning with the rise of Caesar Augustus as the first emperor, is a period of great peace and prosperity in the Roman Empire, the vast Roman Empire.